We are pleased again to welcome John Thatamanil, who is Associate Professor of Theology and World Religions at the Union Theological Seminary in New York. He teaches a wide variety of courses in the area of interreligious engagement, especially in the Hindu-Christian dialogue and Buddhist-Christian dialogues. His book, Circling the Elephant, A Comparative Theology of Religious Diversity, which explores Christian approaches to religious diversity, will be coming out in early May. And he is presently working on his third book, tentatively entitled The Quest for Interreligious Wisdom. Professor Thatamanil also publishes on blogs and op-eds in a variety of venues on topics such as ecotheology and American gun violence. He has published in the Los Angeles Times and the Washington Post. Like Swami Sarvapriyananda, Professor Thatamanil has a special interest in Hindu and Buddhist forms of non-dualism, but his special interest is in just how knowledge, or rather the wisdom of non-duality, is acquired. Just how do we become religiously and even interreligiously wise? The subject of his talk today is Indic wisdom and love of truth in the midst of the fake news crisis. Professor, please.
Oh, there's a strategically placed watch here that will keep me from exceeding my time limits. So, well, let's begin the way Swamiji would begin. Om Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. What an honor and joy it is to be with you today. I so very much enjoyed my last time with you and would count it one of the most memorable and enjoyable experiences of my teaching life. Your intense curiosity and passionate questions made my time with you challenging but also rewarding. But I must say that being here is also a bit daunting. My wife, Kate Newman, who sends her greetings, listens to Swami Sarvapriyananda's talks at least a couple of times a week. So I'm always hearing him in the background as I do my various activities. And as I listen, I hear him delivering these stunningly erudite lectures full of humor, stories, and careful explanation, all without a trace of notes. And I'm left baffled and astonished as to how he manages to pull that off. I will not try to match his matchless teaching. Nonetheless, I will do my best and very much hope for your patience and indulgence. And one personal note before I get into my material. As you know, I am a Christian theologian, but I'm also one who has studied the Advaita tradition with Swami Paramarthananda of Chennai. So in a curious way, I often feel very much an insider to the broad Advaita Vedanta community. So when I use the word our today, I think you will hear me fully in that mode of being one among us, one among you, and I hope that comes through as well. I trust that the spirit of the Vedanta Society will welcome such curious misfits as myself, and for that I'm grateful. In today's talk, I will do something that routinely happens in Christian sermons, in Christian churches, and that is the work of bringing the classical teachings of the tradition to bear on some contemporary issue. The great gift of doing that is that we come to realize that our traditions don't just help us to navigate questions of ultimate truth, paramarthika satya, but also vyavaharika satya, of conventional truth. How to live wisely and compassionately in the muddled world of ordinary affairs. I hope and pray that my talk does that. So let me begin. Everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not to his own facts. I suspect most of you have heard that expression. So famously said U.S. Senator and one-time ambassador to India, Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Always one blessed with a gift for words, Moynihan's famous utterance has about it the ring of stark and obvious clarity. I mean, who could argue? Now, nearly 2 decades after his passing, I wonder what Senator Moynihan would say about the condition of truth in our time. Truth, whether with a capital or lower t, appears to be in critical condition, if not on its deathbed. Both in Western academic circles and more urgently in popular culture, it now seems that every single person has his or her own truth. Shared judgment and agreement on just what the truth appears to be is apparently entirely out of reach. And political partisanship in particular has so warped the fabric of our experience that coming to shared agreement about the truth, or even what the simple facts are, seems impossible. These days, we cannot agree even on established scientific claims, like the safety and efficacy of vaccines, and the fact that global warming is in fact happening, despite the fact of nearly 100% consensus among the scientific community. We have leading global political figures who, without the slightest trace of embarrassment, claim that night is day and day is night. Nowadays, it seems, contrary to Senator Moynihan, that everyone is indeed entitled to their own facts. And if we cannot agree about what is the case, then how can we come to any kind of agreement about what should be the case? Agreement about the facts are the basis on which we stage deliberations about how things ought to be. And if there's no agreement about facts, then we have no basis for further judgment and ethical deliberation and action. Only chaos can follow. Where there is no possibility for agreement about the facts, the threat of violence is not far away. Consider one telling instance. I think some of you may have heard about this from last year. Some of you may remember that over the course of the last 2 years, the fact-checking website, Snopes.com, came under attack. The following claim was made, pitting one fact-check site against the other. And this is a quote from a news article. Actually, this is the quote, the spurious quote from that went viral on Facebook. Factcheck.org exposed Snopes.com as an extremely liberal propaganda site with an agenda to discredit anything that appears to be conservative, the Post says. Snopes has no employees and its owner has zero investigative research experience, and Facebook has hired him to fact-check the news on Facebook. And Soros and the DNC have just been exposed as Snopes' only client. What does that tell you? George Soros and DNC propaganda site. Now, as most of you, I suspect, know, factcheck.org did no such thing. And it immediately debunked the charge, making it clear that they made no such claim. And Snopes also refuted the charge and rejected any connection to any political party or donor. To me, that whole incident is revealing of where we are now. Actual fact-check sites are under attack, precisely because they enable us to sort out fact from fiction. Why? So that misinformation, propaganda, and outright lies can be disseminated. If no one can tell what the truth is, then spin wins. Whoever controls the narrative determines the truth. Might doesn't just make right. Might dictates what the facts are. Don't believe your lying eyes. Believe dear leader or the party. Now, this entire situation should be of special concern to persons who belong to Indic traditions, but specifically to Vedantins. Satya, truth, is the central preoccupation of Indian thought, arguably the whole of it, but certainly our tradition. How to understand truth and how to gain secure access to truth is a widely debated matter within Indian traditions, the broad Vedanta tradition included, but that we ought to seek the truth, that the truth is knowable, even if not easily obtained, and that there are carefully prescribed means for arriving at the truth. By and large, there's a broad consensus within Indic traditions about these basic claims. Skepticism about the possibility of truth is a fairly extreme minority position within the Indian scene. Far more characteristic is the affirmation that truth is just another name for God or ultimate reality. Recall the basic affirmation of our tradition. Satyam Jnanam Anantam Brahma. Right? Ultimate reality just is Satyam, truth, knowledge, Jnanam, and infinity, Anantam. For Vedantins, to give up on the possibility of truth and knowledge of truth is inconceivable. No access to truth, then no access to liberation, to moksha. What we cherish and name as the ultimate human goal and purpose, our parama purushartha, would be unattainable, right? So for us, truth is a rather significant preoccupation. And in modern Indian life, the very establishment of India as a nation rests on the resolute practice of truth itself, namely satyagraha, which Gandhiji variously translated as truth force, or holding on to truth, or insistence on truth. It's a stunning fact of our common life as Indians that at least at the origins of the nation, there stands a remarkable equation on which Gandhi insisted. Truth equals nonviolence. Satya equals ahimsa. The mathematical corollary of that equation is falsehood equals violence. And I think that is strictly entailed. Mithya is himsa. We have, I think, yet to fully understand the significance of these two equations. We need to study Gandhi more carefully to fully appreciate that. But one conclusion can follow. Before tyrants and dictators attack anyone with the force of weapons, they first launch attacks on truth itself. Attacks on truth and attacks on bodies are closely related. The bodies of immigrants, of ethnic, racial, or religious minorities. These two forms of violence are just two sides of the same coin. They are inseparable. It stands to reason, then, that Vedantins, given our conviction that truth is one of the primary names for God, or rather the truth just is God, ought to be deeply concerned when we see truth imperiled. When it seems that we can no longer tell the difference between truth and falsehood, fact and fiction, we ought to be rightly concerned that violence is abroad in the land. Any assault on truth, on reality itself, is always an assault on those who are vulnerable, because those who have power to redefine what truth is always do so to protect their own interests, at the expense of those who appear to lack the power to resist. Vedantins, above all others, ought to be concerned then when we see truth under fire. when we see ourselves living in the era of fake news. But how did we arrive at this predicament? This era in which truth itself is under assault. Does the Vedanta tradition have any wisdom to offer us? Might the Vedanta tradition come to our rescue in these perilous times? Might Vedanta have anything to teach us? As you can imagine, I think Vedanta has a great deal to teach us about what has gone awry. But I want to back into that with some help from the 20th century French philosopher Michel Foucault. Why a detour through Foucault? Sometimes he's actually blamed as being part of the reason for the postmodern condition and the slippage between power and truth. So he seems an unlikely character to come to our aid. But the Foucault I have in mind is the late Foucault, who has, I think, a great deal to teach us. Writings from the last few years of his life, particularly some of his lectures, I think helps us to understand the current global malady, our inability to arrive at truth. And we will see that Foucault's wisdom is remarkably resonant with Advaita wisdom. So for the rest of my talk, I will oscillate between Foucault and Shankaracharya. It's weird, I know. But you invited me. So, in his writing, Foucault argues that modernity, specifically beginning with the Enlightenment, if not slightly before, was the first time in human history that people came to believe that all one needs to see the truth is to open one's eyes. Prior to that period, and I think this is certainly true for Vedanta, truth does not simply stand up and announce itself. Truth requires that one who seeks the truth pay the price for obtaining it, the price of self-transformation. No self-transformation, no knowledge. Let me explain what I mean. One would think, on the face of it, that in Vedanta, above all, discovering the truth would be an incredibly simple matter. Why? Because the truth just is what we are. It is one's very self. And none of us is or could ever be separated from that truth, even for a single moment. So the great truth of the Advaita tradition is, Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman. And yet, this truth that is closest to us seems peculiarly the most elusive of all. Why? Because few are willing to pay the price that would lead to its discovery. What that price is and how it leads us to truth, I will come back to in a little while. But I think if we look there, I think we'll begin to have an understanding of the conditions that plague us in this present moment. But let's have Foucault help us here. Foucault begins his now famous lectures, The Hermeneutics of the Subject, for the year 1981 to 1982 at the Collège de France by taking us back to Socrates. In fact, even before Socrates, to the famous words inscribed in the temple of Apollo. I suspect all of you know this. Know thyself. In Greek, nothi sauton. Know thyself. It is generally understood that these words formed the core of Socrates' sense of vocation, his sense of calling. We understood that Socrates' annoying and ultimately angering work, the work that led to his execution, was motivated by these two words, know thyself. He constantly interrogated Athenians about what they took to be true, what they believed they knew for sure in order to produce authentic self-knowledge. But Foucault argues that when you read Socrates as presented to us by Plato, we routinely miss something important. The phrase "nothi sauton" is routinely paired, Foucault's expression is twinned, with another expression, epimelia hetu in the Greek, which he translates as care of oneself. Care of oneself. He then goes on to argue that the phrase twinned is not quite the right word. If you read the text carefully, he argues that know thyself is always subordinated to care of oneself. Care of oneself is the primary work, and knowing oneself is an aspect or part of that larger project of self-care. Or to put it still in another way, only care of oneself can produce knowledge of oneself. Here, let me offer a long quote from Foucault, in which he quotes Socrates from Plato's Apology. This is all from Foucault quoting Plato, together with some of Foucault's comments. Here are Socrates' words. Athenians, I am grateful to you and love you, but I shall obey God rather than you, and be sure that I will not stop practicing philosophy so long as I have breath and am able to, exhorting you and telling whoever I meet what they should do. Now Foucault again. And what advice would Socrates give if he is not condemned, since he had already given it before he was accused? To those he meets, he will say, as he is accustomed to saying, Dear friend, you are an Athenian, citizen of the greatest city, more famous than any other for its knowledge and might. Yet are you not ashamed for devoting all your care to increasing your wealth, reputation, and honors, while not caring for or even considering your reason, truth, and the constant improvement of your soul? Note the recurrence of this word, care. Thus, Socrates recalls that what he has always said and is quite determined to continue to say to those he will meet and stop to question. You care for the whole range of things, for your wealth and your reputation. You do not care for yourself. He goes on, and this is again a quote from Plato. And if anyone argues and claims that he does care for his soul, for truth, for reason, don't think I shall let him go and go on my way. No, I shall question him, examine him, and argue with him at length. You see why he wasn't very popular. Whoever I may meet, young or old, stranger or a fellow citizen, this is how I shall act, and especially with you, my fellow citizens, since you are my kin. For you should understand that this is what the God demands. And I believe that nothing better has fallen this city than my zeal in executing this command. Not one short for self-confidence. This command, then, is the command by which the gods have entrusted Socrates with the task of stopping people, young and old, citizens or strangers, and saying to them, attend to yourselves. This is Socrates' task. You see that? Know thyself is a part of care of the self. No care of the self, no possibility of knowledge. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So why is it so important that Foucault insists that care of the self is the larger framework? Because Foucault argues that there is a consensus in Greek thought, indeed all of Roman thought, and eventually Christian thought also, that there is no possibility of coming to know the truth apart from transformative self-care. You cannot know what is true apart from becoming a person who is fit to receive the truth. Here again, let's listen to a long quote from Foucault. It's beautiful. I think this will really resonate with so much in the Vedanta tradition. The care of the self implies a certain way of attending to what we think and what takes place in our thought. The word epimelia is related to melete, which means both exercise and meditation. The notion of epimelia does not merely designate this general attitude or this form of attention turned on the self. The epimelia always designates a number of actions exercised on the self by the self, actions by which one takes responsibility for oneself, and by which one changes, purifies, transforms, and transfigures oneself. It involves a series of practices, most of which are exercises that will have a very long destiny in the history of Western culture, philosophy, morality, and spirituality. These are, for example, techniques of meditation, memorization of the past, examination of the conscience, of checking representations which appear in the mind, and so on. Listen again to these key phrases. The epimelia also always designates a number of actions exercised on the self, by the self, actions by which one takes responsibility for oneself, and by which one changes, purifies, transforms, and transfigures oneself. Only by undertaking the work of transfiguring oneself can you become the person who is capable of knowing the truth. No transfiguration, no truth. Foucault tells us that this consensus around care of the self obtained for 1,000 years between 5th century BCE, before the Common Era, to the 5th century of the Common Era. Of course, Foucault and I would argue that this tradition of care of the self continues forward for the rest of Western history, but into and through the Christian monastic tradition. Care of the self has never in truth been utterly lost, although it has slipped out of the mainstream. But, yes, out of the mainstream. It has been lost in the general public sphere in the modern West. When? When did care of the self go missing in our common public Western culture? How did that happen, and when and why? Well, these are enormously complex questions, and if we sought to address them fully, I would never return to Vedanta. So I will summarize Foucault's argument very quickly, at the risk of caricature. Foucault argues that a key, if not the philosophical culprit, is René Descartes. With Descartes, Foucault argues that knowledge of the self and care of the self become separated from each other. From Descartes on, Foucault argues that there was a divorce between know thyself and care of oneself. Because Descartes held that you don't need to undertake any particular set of practices to come to know the self. Why? Because it's impossible to doubt the existence of the self. The self is simply self-evident. You know the famous argument, right? Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. You don't need to have any practices of self-care or transfiguration to realize that. It is self-evident, clear and self-evident. I need no special practices of care to come to self-knowledge. Now here, Vedantins will hear a striking similarity to Shankara in his Brahma Sutra Bhashya. This is a direct quote from Shankara. The self is not absolutely beyond apprehension, because it is apprehended as the content of the concept I, and because the self, as opposed to the non-self, is well known in the world as an immediately perceived, self-revealing entity. You see the remarkable similarity there? A number of scholars, pretty much anyone who knows Shankara, has pointed out that Shankara seems to have anticipated Descartes by several centuries. So they seem to agree that knowledge of the self is, in some sense, self-revealing and self-evident. But there's a profound point of difference between Shankara and Descartes. To take the self to be self-evident is not to know just what the self is. And as you know, we can go grievously wrong in how we understand the nature of the self. We know Shankara's basic diagnosis. This is the kind of thing Swamiji talks a lot about, so I don't have to spend a great deal of time here. We know that the self exists, but we are ignorant of the self's true nature because of adhyasa, right? Superimposition. We confuse the eternal, unchanging light of consciousness with the body-mind complex. So we come to think of the self as finite, embodied, threatened, and vulnerable. And this false knowledge about who we are kicks up the impulses of raga, dvesha, and moha. And that entire karmic cycle gets going. The true nature of the self, then, is anything but self-evident. That there is a self may be self-evident, but not what you are. To come to understand the true nature of the self, Shankara and Foucault would argue that you require transfiguration. You need care of the self. We will have to become capable of understanding the true nature of the self, and that will take some doing. So in Shankara, there is no divorce between know thyself and care of the self. They go together. Only through care of the self can one come to know the self. Clear so far? Okay, good. Now back to Foucault for just another few minutes. Foucault concludes the early part of his argument about care of the self by making a distinction between what he calls philosophy and spirituality. Here's another longer quote. This is all Foucault, not him quoting anyone else. We will call philosophy the form of thought that asks what it is that enables the subject to have access to the truth, and which attempts to determine the conditions and limits of the subject's access to the truth. If we call this philosophy, then I think we could call spirituality the search, practice, and experience through which the subject carries out the necessary transformations on himself in order to have access to the truth. Let me read that sentence again. We could call spirituality the search, practice, and experience through which the subject carries out the necessary transformations on himself in order to have access to the truth. We will call spirituality, then, the set of these researches, ascetic exercises, renunciations, conversions of looking, modifications of existence, which are not for knowledge, but for the subject, for the subject's very being, the price to be paid for access to truth. Right? Spirituality is then this entire set of disciplines, which is, as he calls it, the price to be paid for access to truth. Okay, continuing here. Spirituality postulates that truth is never given to the subject by right. Spirituality postulates that the subject as such does not have the right of access to the truth and is not capable of having access to the truth. It postulates that truth is not given to the subject by a simple act of knowledge, like just opening your eyes. It postulates that for the subject to have right of access to the truth, he must be changed, transformed, shifted, and become to some extent and up to a certain point other than himself. The truth is only given to the subject at a price that brings the subject's being into play. For as he is, the subject is not capable of truth. I think that this is the simplest but most fundamental formula by which spirituality can be defined. It follows that from this point of view, there can be no truth without a conversion or a transformation of the subject. Close quote. It's striking, isn't it? I think it's one of the best definitions of spirituality that I've ever seen. The set of disciplines and practices, the price to be paid, that transforms us such that we are fit and capable of seeing the truth. No spirituality, no access to the truth. All of this should sound very familiar to you. You're like, oh, Foucault must have ripped this off from Shankaracharya. Right? For Advaitins, none of this is particularly surprising, because the Advaita tradition affirms that you and I have to be transformed if we will have access to Brahmajnana. My friend Anantananda Rambachan puts it this way. This is a beautiful quote from Anant. Brahmajnana is the appreciation of oneself to be of the unique nature of Brahman. And the receptacle of this knowledge is the mind, antakarana. If Brahmajnana is to be meaningfully and successfully attained, it is imperative that the mind enjoys a certain disposition. If the Atman to be known is all peace and fullness, such a knowledge cannot occur in a mind which is in perpetual agitation and which entertains countless desires. The beauty and joy of a self which shines in everything cannot be discovered in a mind lacking in compassion and love. The significance of Brahmajnana will be lost to the one who has not risen above the yearning and pursuit after limited ends. It is vital here, therefore, that the receptacle of knowledge, the mind, relatively conforms to the nature of the object which it seeks to know. So the mind has to become like the Atman which it seeks to know. We see here a profound resonance between what Foucault says about spirituality and philosophy, or the quest for knowledge, and what Dr. Rambachan has to say about arriving at Brahmajnana, knowledge of Brahman. The receptacle of knowledge has to conform to the nature of the object which it seeks to know. If it cannot do that, it cannot come to be established in the knowledge of Brahman. Without transforming the mind, one cannot be a sthita prajna, to use the language of the Bhagavad Gita. One cannot be established in wisdom. This concern for transformation of the mind, what Foucault calls spirituality, is why Advaitins don't just spend a lot of time on what Western philosophers call epistemology, the discipline that seeks to establish how we know what we know. We also spend, and we do spend time on that, right? That's pramana theory. Do we come to know ultimate truth by perception, inference, or scripture, shabda pramana? But in addition to these questions, and I would say just as important, if not more important, is the question of what kind of person you need to be in order to be a good student who can come to know Brahman. That question preoccupies Vedantins quite a good deal. And that discussion is captured under the rubric of sadhana chatushtaya, the 4 basic prerequisites for knowledge of Brahman. Again, you know all of this, so I won't spend a great deal of time on it, but you know these. Shankara puts it this way. Here are the 4 that are required. They are discrimination between the eternal and the non-eternal, viveka, dispassion for the enjoyment of the fruits of work here and hereafter, vairagya, a perfection of such practices as control of the mind, control of the sense and organs, shama adi, sadhana sampatti, and a hankering or a desire for liberation. Number 4, mukshitvam. Granted the existence of these qualities, Brahman can be deliberated on and known. We might say that the student of Advaita has to pay the price necessary to acquire these qualities. It would take us a long time to work up a detailed account of the kinds of practices that generate these qualities and stabilize these qualities, but you know the basic model, right? The Bhagavad Gita is for Shankara particularly important, karma yoga, the practice of one's dharma without attachment to the fruits of one's action, right? That is how we practice in the course of our daily life, acquiring what the tradition calls chitta shuddhi, purity of mind. And it is through purity of mind that those qualities like viveka and vairagya are established in the self. But there is one form of desire that the Advaita tradition also explicitly encourages. Mumukshitvam, the desire for liberation. Anantananda Rambachan describes mumukshitvam as follows. Mumukshitvam is a burning desire for moksha. Burning desire for moksha. It is the flame that is fed by all the aforementioned qualities. Unless there is a deep earnestness and sincerity of purpose, efforts will be mediocre. Close quote. Here we see a feature of the Advaita tradition that is often misunderstood and mischaracterized. And this mischaracterization also applies to the Buddhist traditions. Because both traditions invest a lot of time and energy criticizing narrow, self-centered, and egoistic desires, they get a bad rap as anti-desire traditions, right? That Advaita is anti-desire. Buddhism is anti-desire. But that's not true. This is profoundly wrong. Mahayana Buddhists explicitly commit themselves to save all sentient beings. That seems like a pretty big desire to me, right? In like manner, Advaita students are asked to cultivate a burning desire for liberation, which is also a burning desire for truth. And what is liberation for Advaitins? Ultimately, liberation is just another word for Brahman. Why? Because Brahman is never not liberated. Liberation and Brahman are interchangeable terms. And because Brahman is Satyam Jnanam Anantam, to desire liberation is also to desire truth. Mumukshitvam, the desire for liberation, is the love and desire for truth. So we who are inspired by the truth of Advaita must be driven by a burning desire for truth and stand ready to pay the price for gaining access to self-transformation. You might at this point be saying, well, John, you've made a pretty good argument, but I see a problem in your talk. At least in the case of Advaita Vedanta, you do need to undergo spiritual transformation, but that's if you want Brahmajnana. You need Viveka, Vairagya, and the rest if you want to know the nature of ultimate reality. Surely no such spiritual transformation is required if you want to know the world of ordinary objects. For that, all you need to do is open your eyes. If you want to know about the world, you just need pratyaksha, right? Pratyaksha, what is before your eyes. And then, of course, inference, anumana. So there are pramanas available for conventional truth. So you don't need any spiritual transformation to know the ordinary world. Now, at a strictly speaking logical level, or an epistemological level, that's true. But knowing is not just an epistemological matter. What Vedanta teaches us, I think, is that even ordinary knowing requires self-transformation. I once thought that spirituality was the price that we needed to pay to gain access to Paramarthika Satya, for ultimate truth. But I thought no such price needs to be paid for Vyavaharika Satya. But you just need to open up the newspaper or go to Facebook to realize that is not true. Our capacity to see this world clearly, this very ordinary world, also requires chitta shuddhi, purification of mind. So long as we remain under the spell of raga, dvesha, and moha, of craving, aversion, and delusion, what in the world can we see clearly? We can't even see our beloved ones clearly if we are under the grip of raga, dvesha, and moha. For example, if dvesha, hatred, aversion, or rage is beyond our control, then we're in deep trouble. Why? Because if we cannot tame our rage, we become the playthings of those institutions, technologies, and media that know how to toy with our rage. If artificial intelligence can monitor our social media use, work up a profile of our political loyalties, our musical preferences, our sexual proclivities, our racial biases, our religious and ethnic prejudices, and so know just exactly what will infuriate us, then we can be provoked, pushed, and prodded into action before we register what is even happening to us. If foreign actors can use bots and big data to cajole us into clicking, retweeting, and even voting as they see fit, then we remain at their terrible mercy. A politics of rage now fuels fratricidal partisanship that is fraying the fabric of both nations many of us call home. We are being carried away by riptides that roil the ocean of feeling in which we constantly swim, or perhaps I should say drown. Our psychic lives are no longer our own. So it would seem then that the work of spirituality, for us that means karma yoga, broadly construed, is a necessary set of disciplines that we must practice if we want to live a meaningful life here and now, not just for the sake of moksha. Then should this be news to us Vedantins? After all, the ideal for which we strive is Jivan Mukta, right? Which is not living somewhere else. It's living liberation, right here, right now, which equips us to live with subtlety and discernment and restraint and discrimination to navigate the issues of this very life. So I think Foucault's argument that we need spiritual transformation to see any kind of truth whatsoever is a rich complement to the wisdom of Shankaracharya. Spirituality, understood as the work of self-transformation, is required to gain access to all truth, Vyavaharika and Paramarthika. Let us pray that we shall be committed ever more strongly to the pursuit of truth and pay the price required. Thank you. This is my favorite part. Much better than hearing myself speak. Please say your name.
My name is Girish, and my question is, it sounds almost like an oxymoron, but aren't there multiple ultimate realities based on the tradition you're in? I mean, the ultimate reality of Advaita is different from the ultimate reality of Buddhism, of Christianity. So Is it one mountain with several routes going up, as they say, or is there several different peaks?
For that you should buy my book. It's coming out in May, and it's entirely dedicated to that. And as you know, I addressed this topic the last time I came. So I don't know if you were here or not. So from my perspective, I much prefer, and hence the title of the coming book, the ancient Indic story of the blind man and the elephant. I prefer the elephant narrative to the mountain narrative because in the elephant narrative, each of the blind persons picks up on something really different, correct? That's the basis of their disagreement. They disagree because each says, well, you fool, this thing is obviously like a tree trunk. And another one saying, how can that be? It's plainly a wall. And another one says, you both are fools. It's a spear. Everyone can tell this is a spear, and so on. You know how that story goes. But it turns out that they were all correct when they were affirming what they knew, and they were all wrong when they sought to deny what the other knew. So the point of that allegory, and it's actually an allegory much loved by Ramakrishna himself, there are multiple dimensions to ultimate reality. Ultimate reality can genuinely be experienced and encountered as both personal and transpersonal. That point is made with great lucidity and philosophical detail in Ayon Maharaja's book that I think some of you are familiar with, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality. So I would agree that there is one ultimate reality, but not a single truth. You need the multiplicity of the religious traditions in order to arrive at the full truth. And even then, you'll never arrive at the full truth because the infinite will always infinitely exceed all these truths. In other words, the title of my book, Circling the Elephant, can't quite work because if the elephant is infinite, you can never circle it. Right? So that's how I would answer that question. Interestingly, though, there's surprising agreement about the kinds of self-transformation one needs to undergo, and even some of the practices. So Buddhists and Hindus may have fierce arguments about the nature of ultimate reality, but broadly speaking, you would find considerable agreement about things like the sadhana chatushtaya, right? About the need for cultivating viveka and vairagya, samadhamma, etc. So, but for the purposes of this talk, I think that Foucault has named our predicament correctly, right? We have entered into a 300-year, 1700 on, mistake in the West to divorce care of oneself from truth, from knowing the self. And because we dropped care of the self out, we think we can just know by opening our eyes. And it's pretty evident now that none of us can do that, right? So on that, I think there would be consensus across traditions. We need spirituality in order to see.
Thank you very much for the very enlightening and articulated thought.
And your name again?
My name is Patrick.
Patrick.
I was curious, and I could have heard wrong, but it seemed that you said that truth is in danger or in peril. And I think from a Vedantic perspective, the idea that truth is never in peril,
Yeah.
and the idea also that maybe there's a path where you don't even need this world and you kind of like give up on it and kind of just focus on that. And then maybe Swami Vivekananda kind of came in with more of what you were talking about, but I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay. Yes, I think if I were to be philosophically and theologically precise, what I should have said is that our access to truth is imperiled. Truth itself is never in peril, right? So the infinite cannot be threatened by the doings of the finite. So on that point, I will plead guilty to rhetorical exaggeration. But you see my point, right? Yeah. So I will agree with that. Within the Advaita tradition, there is more or less two basic forks in the road, where some really emphasize the doctrine of Maya so strongly that it gives the impression that this world and its Sturm und Drang, its chaos and its confusions matters not a bit, right? That ultimate truth is ultimate, and this is merely the play of appearances. But there is another strand within the Vedanta that says that runs a profound risk of downgrading the truth of the ordinary world so severely that it can lead to a kind of false detachment, lacking in compassion and care. Informed as I am primarily by my study of Shankara himself, one of the things you discover is that he actually almost never uses the word Maya. Yeah, he uses mithya, ajnana, but not Maya. And so the idea that the world is merely a play of appearances is not in fact to be found at the core of this tradition. It's important to note the little Sanskrit particle iva in a lot of the writing, right? This world is like an illusion, not that it is an illusion. And it's only like an illusion when compared to the unchanging absolute ground of all reality. So that perspective, together with the affirmation of Jivan Mukti, right? Liberation while living, and the characterization of the guru or the swami or the teacher as a daya sindhu, an ocean of compassion, should, I think, lead us to a more realistic ontology, to use the technical language, one in which the pain and suffering of the world is taken with great care, not so that we're attached to it, but so that we can alleviate it. So I think that strand of the Vedanta tradition is very much present, and I worry when the illusionistic strand is affirmed a bit too much. So, yeah.
My question is that in spiritual sphere, there is so much hue and cry, like what is ultimate truth? And up till now, about the ultimate truth, the answer is always in confusion. There has not been any solid, concrete example of one ultimate truth. All we have the notion, some abstract idea, like Pirech in the desert or Wasfo wheel. So actually, what is ultimate truth? It is just an enigma, like enigma.
Yeah. So in the and that's a fantastic question, of course. In the Christian tradition, I'm often reminded by Augustine, St. Augustine's great saying, if you know it, it's not God. Right? Because the infinite cannot be known. So in a sense, you're right. The ultimate truth exceeds our grasp. And if it didn't, it wouldn't be the ultimate truth. So we have to be mindful that that basic conundrum or puzzle or mystery haunts our lives. But nonetheless, our various traditions have ways of talking about ultimate truth. And the song we just sang, which was an integral part of my talk, is our way of talking about ultimate reality. Satyam, Jnanam, Anantam, Brahma. That ultimate reality is being itself and truth, sat slash satya. That ultimate reality is Jnanam, which means chit, right? The light of consciousness that shines in our mind. That light by which we know what we know, but cannot itself be known, that is ultimate reality. And that chit is not just a finite construction. It's not not a product of my mind, but it's anantam. It's infinite. So, for me, when I'm speaking to Advaitins from my Advaita self, I think Satyam Jnanam Anantam Brahma comes pretty close to what we can say about the ultimate, even while we know that all words fail, including Satyam Jnanam Anantam. Right? Those are pointers pointing to what is nearer to us than we are to ourselves. So that's the tradition's way of teaching us about what truth is. So, but on these matters, you have Swami Sarvapriyananda's teaching, so you don't need me for that. I don't know who's passing around the mic. Okay.
Thank you, Professor. My name is Prakhyat. It makes sense that the lack of fourfold qualifications can loosen the grip on even the day-to-day truths.
That's my suspicion.
But do you think that it has become harder in the modern age to achieve those fourfold qualifications, especially the sixfold disciplines that are built into that's quite daunting.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, today you have more security, more stability, economic stability, which should also help in achieving those qualifications. So what's your insight on that? And do you have any tips and guidance on how to overcome the modern challenges in achieving those qualifications?
Well, I mean, you're asking me a question that I grapple with in the course of my daily life, right? So this is not a theoretical question. This is a question for all of us. It's worth remembering that most of our traditions in the Indian context say that this practice may take multiple lifetimes. So in a sense, no one has ever told you that this would be easy. So that is more or less to be taken for granted. Right? There's something daunting about this task. I do think that this task is becoming more complicated in the digitized age. I think, and I often say this in a variety of contexts, that the primary spirituality of the modern age is the most comprehensive spirituality ever introduced, and that is the spirituality of the market, right? Of the perpetual manufacturing of desire for the sake of consumerism. The most effective religious tradition ever invented is capitalism, right? So I routinely say that in most Christian churches, the minister may have 12 to 15 minutes to make a sermon. I'm so happy you gave me more time. Here, you can spend a couple of hours working, but the market is telling you what to desire while you sleep, right? Because the dreams of the psyche are shaped by markets and media and advertising. And so there's a way in which your spirituality is what you do with your desire, right? Is your desire mumukshu, right? It's the desire for moksha? Or is it your desire for the latest and savviest whatever, the iPhone 11 Max Pro, right? So if our desires are being colonized by, advertising and media and social included, then I do think it's very hard in this particular moment to cultivate those qualities. So I think that might also be why people are beginning once more to talk with some care about spirituality. Of course, the trick is capitalism knows how to sell you spirituality for $9.99. Download the app, you'll be spiritual. And then even our desire for spirituality can be commodified, right? If you don't have the right app, if you don't have the zabuton and the zafu, the meditation cushions to sit on, and some nice robes, some nice meditation robes, that would be nice too, right? So I do agree that there's a tremendous set of complicated devices are arrayed against us to colonize our raga, dvesha, and moha. So I fully will recognize the difficulty of this project in our time. That's why we have to do this. That's why we have to gather here on not just Sundays, and then take up some disciplines, including some meditative disciplines, so that we know how to unplug and redirect the stream of desire that's swimming through our psychic lives, seeking to dominate us. Yeah.
Can I ask another question, Professor? Yeah.
Oh, I can be. Yeah, that's up to you. You control the schedule. There's still plenty of questions in the air. Oh, yeah, lots. Okay.
Good afternoon, Professor. Thank you for the wonderful talk, and there were several excellent points that I'm going to go think about. I would like for you to explain more one of the points you made at the beginning of the talk, where you said this formula, truth equals nonviolence. Truth and nonviolence, in a way, are both practices which can be thought of as separate practices, satya and ahimsa, but I can see how they're related. So I'm very curious to see how you derived the derivation to the formula. Perhaps you thought, is it more like one leads to the other, or is it that they both the results of both converge in the ultimate truth, or what is it? How do they differ in the ultimate versus the transactional reality? Because one of their axioms that I've heard from another Swami is unselfishness is God. Is it something like that? I would like to hear more about that formula. Yeah.
This is a deep question, and my feeling is that that it's something we discern the more we live into it. And I do think that Gandhiji was onto something here that we have yet to begin to fully appreciate. And it's also discovered not just in thinkers like Gandhi, but it's most especially Gandhi, but I think you also find it in people like the great German philosopher Hannah Arendt, who talked about the power of the lie and the relationship between the lie and totalitarianism. So we need to think about this. And I'm just at, I would say, compared to, if Gandhi thought he was at step one of understanding this truth. If he's at step one, I'm at, -7 or 20 or something like that. But if truth is an attempt to let's begin transactionally, to let the world show itself to us, right? To see the world as it presents itself to us, then when we distort what wants to show itself to us through raga, dvesha, and moha, that's itself already a kind of violence, right? We're doing violence to reality because we want it to conform to our way of seeing it rather than letting it show itself to us. So there's already a kind of, we might say, a cognitive violence that precedes physical violence, right? So I think that's the close connection between truth and violence. And remember, Gandhi also translated this sometimes as love force, not just truth force. When we are present to the world as it is, rather than as we want it to be, that itself is a form of love. Do you see that? Because we're letting the world show itself, and we are pulled and drawn toward it through healthy desire, not the desire that seeks to distort, own, claim, and possess. If that's true, then truth and love and nonviolence are intimately connected. Intimately connected. So I hope that helps you. Now, at the Paramarthika Satya level, ultimate reality is truth, is love. So I see. That's why I think that we ought not to separate Vyaharika and Paramarthika Satya too much. There are some purposes for which we want to make those distinctions. But how can we, if we're true Advaitins, right? If we're true non-dualists, it's hard to say, well, this world is somehow of less importance than the ultimate, because this is the ultimate in a profound and ultimate sense. Yeah.
My name is Rodrigo, and I just wanted to ask, Socrates seems to be probably one of the first impolitically correct persons that existed. And I wonder if you early said that correcting yourself, that access to truth is in peril. So do you think that part of that danger of that access, it is because of all these politically correct arguments that are constantly floating around? I mean, I totally understand and agree that we have to avoid violence by any means, but we'll ornament truth with falseness to avoid violence? How we can compromise? What is the limit of compromise? Compromising truth, to avoid difficult situations,
So, in Indic traditions, when we speak about truth or violence, let's say violence, we are always talking about three things simultaneously: thought, word, and deed, right? So what we think, what we say, and what we do, all three are potentially forms of truth or falsity, violence or nonviolence. So that means that exercising great care with our speech, with our categories, with how we name and describe people, right? We might call that political correctness, but for those of us who are Advaitins, who care about vach, our speech, as well as mind, manas, before we get to karma, deed, then how we think and how we speak and the categories by which we think and speak also need to be attended to. And I'm very cautious about people who say that being careful about the terms is somehow political correctness. Well, is it kind? Is it tender? Is it a way of allowing people to name their own identities, their own histories, right? If it is, then we should bend over backwards to make sure that our speech and our thinking, not merely our actions, are marked by great care and tenderness. Yeah. So I don't think political correctness is the problem. I don't think that's the issue. I think there are the attempts to say that some of us matter more than others, That's a problem. That raga, dvesha, and moha take structural forms, political and economic. That's a problem. That some 2,000 people, billionaires, own as much wealth as 4.6 billion others. That's a problem, right? So those kinds of structural problems, especially this last one, this mass inequity and inequality between roughly 2,000 people and billions of people in the world. Why? No. Now that strikes me as some pretty severe manifestation of raga, right? That for me is the problem, not so much, in my estimation, political correctness. So shall we stop there and continue our conversations downstairs? Okay. Thank you again. What a treat to be with you.